Hello, and welcome to this American History podcast entitled Creating a Constitution. In our last podcast, we learned about the problems our nation faced under the Articles of Confederation. But in this one, you will learn about how these problems led to the creation of the Constitution. In September of 1786, delegates or representatives from 5 states met in Annapolis, Maryland. They wanted to help promote trade among the states, and they wanted to do this by creating national trade laws or trade laws that would be in place for all of the states. But making such changes would require amending or changing the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, as you may remember, the national government had no power to regulate trade among the states. So if there was a conflict between states that had to do with trade, the national government had to sit on the sidelines. They didn't have any control over that. Well, with only 5 of the 13 states sending representatives, you can imagine that very little got done. So the Annapolis delegates called for the states to send representatives to Philadelphia the following May to discuss changes in trade. And probably that might not have worked out, except in the meantime, between the Annapolis Convention and the one that was supposed to be held in May, Shays' Rebellion broke out. Now, we talked about Shays' Rebellion in the last podcast, but you may remember Shays' Rebellion, it sent fear through a lot of people because they saw a rebellion breaking out and they weren't really positive that the national government was strong enough to stop it. So because of the fear that existed, more states, in fact 12 states, sent delegates to Philadelphia. So fear was what caused more states to be involved in the Constitutional Convention than the Annapolis Convention. And this is Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where the convention was to be held. So at this convention, 55 delegates came to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and they were a pretty impressive group. About 3/4 of them had been representatives to the Continental Congresses. Most of the nation's leaders were there, including George Washington, who was the hero of the Revolution. He came out of retirement for the meeting. Benjamin Franklin, the most famous scientist and statesman, he lent his wit and wisdom to the convention. And James Madison, who was one of the most able delegates, one of the most intelligent and educated men there, he had read more than 100 books on government in preparing for the meeting. When Thomas Jefferson served as ambassador to France and read the list of delegates, he wrote, "It's really an assembly of demagogues." Now, it wasn't really a very representative group. There were no women, no blacks, or Native Americans invited to participate in the Constitution. Now, not every leader was there. So again, we have George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and James Madison, who we already talked about. But there were 3 specifically who said they were not coming. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, both of them were not at the meeting because they were overseas. And Patrick Henry refused to go because he opposed the Constitution and the idea of a convention to change the Articles of Confederation. So Jefferson and Adams were overseas, and Patrick Henry said flat out, "I'm not going." In fact, Patrick Henry had been elected as a delegate from Virginia, but he refused to attend because he said he smelled a rat in Philadelphia tending toward monarchy. Well, at first, the delegates who did attend didn't really have a clear idea about what they wanted to do. Some thought they would amend or change the articles. Others thought they'd have to set up a whole new government. They all agreed the plan, whatever they came up with, should protect people's rights. And they all agreed that the government needed to be strong enough to protect people's rights, but it shouldn't be too strong that it couldn't be controlled by the people. Well, the first order of business at the convention was to elect a president, and there was no question there who they were going to choose. Every single delegate voted for George Washington. Next, the delegates had to decide on the rules for the convention. Delegates decided that in order for everybody to speak freely and not be pressured by the politics of the time, that discussions would need to remain secret. Something else they realized as they began to discuss these changes was that they were going to have to do what this image is illustrating. So take a look at that and see if you can figure out what key term or what key idea is being represented by this. If you said compromise, you are correct. The first speaker at the convention, Virginia's Edmund Randolph, proposed a whole new plan of government. His plan was known as the Virginia Plan, and it called for 3 branches of government. The legislature would be made up of 2 houses, so 2 parts, and the number of representatives from each state would be based on the state's population. The larger states supported the plan since the voting is based on population. Larger states would get more power, so more of a voice. Smaller states opposed it, because they believed that larger states would dominate and smaller states wouldn't have much power. So again, this plan favored larger states. New Jersey delegate William Paterson presented a different plan. It was called the New Jersey Plan. This plan called for a one-house legislature in which each state would have 1 vote. Every state represented equally. Of course, this is really going to favor smaller states because regardless of what size you are, you have an equal voice. The smaller states equal power with larger states. You can imagine the larger states aren't going to like the New Jersey Plan. So what the delegates ultimately came up with after some debate was called the Great Compromise, and it solved the problem of representation in the legislature. According to the compromise, the House of Representatives would be based on state populations. So in that house, or in that part of Congress, our lawmaking branch, power would be based on the amount of people you have in your state. That's going to favor large states. But in the Senate, the amount of votes or representation in the Senate is going to be based on equality. So every state is going to have the same amount of votes. Today in the Senate, every state gets 2 votes, but in the House, it's based on your state's population. That is the Great Compromise. It created a 2-house legislature, which we call Congress, with a House of Representatives and a Senate, based on population and based on equality. Next, the convention had to decide who would be counted in the population of each state. Obviously, the counting of population is really important. The more people you have, the more power you have in the House. So we've got to figure out how we're going to count people. And that might sound really easy, but it is not. The southern states wanted slaves to be counted towards representation, but not for taxation. Northern states, who had fewer slaves than the southern states, wanted slaves to be counted for taxation, but not for representation. After some debate, the delegates reached what was called the 3/5 Compromise. So before we talk about compromise, let's talk about what the South was saying here. The South said that slaves should be counted for determining population. They believed everybody should be counted, whether they were slave or free, to determine how many people were living in their state, which would determine how much power they would have in the House. but they didn't want them counted when it came to taxation, because the more people you have, the more taxes you have to pay. So essentially, the South was saying is that slaves are people, but they aren't people. And I know you might say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Exactly, you are exactly correct in that thinking. So the compromise they came up with, since the North argued against this kind of logic, was called the Three-Fifths Compromise. And here's what it said. 3/5 of the slave population would be counted to determine representation in the legislature and in taxation. The convention also agreed that Congress could not ban the slave trade until 1808. So we're not even going to talk about it until 1808. So 5 white people are going to count as 5. But when it comes to counting slaves, for every 5 slaves you have, only 3 of them are going to count. Okay, so let's try a little math problem here based on the 3/5 compromise. If I have 5 slaves, it's going to be equal to how many people in terms of population? 5 slaves is going to be 3. Okay, so here's another one. 25 slaves would count as how many people when we're determining population? If you said 15, you are correct. Okay, one more. 40 slaves would equal how much in population? 24. So if you got that correct, your math teacher would be very proud. The delegates also gave the national government the power to regulate trade or to control trade. The national government could pass laws on how goods could be exported. Remember, this trade issue was a big deal under the Articles of Confederation. The delegates didn't want that to continue to be a problem, so they gave the national government control over regulating trade between states. On September 15th, 1787, all but 3 of the delegates voted to support the Constitution in its final form. Washington sent it to the Confederation Congress, and Congress sent it to the states to be ratified. And in the next podcast, you will learn how the Constitution was ratified. Hope this has helped. Have a great day.